Tonight, we travel back nearly 2,000 years to the heart of the Roman Empire, a world of towering temples, roaring crowds, and spectacles so grand that people journeyed across entire provinces just to witness them. It was an age when emperors ruled millions, armies marched across continents, and the city of Rome stood as the center of the known world. Yet among all the senators, generals, and wealthy citizens who filled the history books, there existed another group of people whose lives were both admired and feared. They were the gladiators. To the crowds, they were heroes, entertainers, and symbols of courage. Their names were cheered by thousands. Their victories were celebrated throughout the empire. Yet behind the excitement of the arena lay a much darker reality. Most gladiators did not choose this life. Many were prisoners of war, slaves, criminals, or desperate men with no other path available to them. Every day they trained knowing that one mistake, one unlucky moment, could mean a violent death before an audience eager for spectacle. Tonight, we will follow the life of one Roman gladiator from beginning to end. We will witness his childhood, the events that brought him into bondage, the brutal training that transformed him into a fighter, and the countless battles he faced beneath the shadow of the arena. We will explore the friendships formed among men who lived with death as a constant companion. We will discover what gladiators ate, where they slept, how they trained, and what they truly felt when the gates opened and thousands of spectators erupted into cheers. Yet this story is not only about violence. It is about survival. It is about hope in a world where freedom seemed impossibly distant. It is about ordinary people struggling to preserve their humanity while living inside a system designed to treat them as property and entertainment. The image most people carry of gladiators is simple: warriors fighting to the death beneath the blazing Roman sun. The truth was far more complicated. Gladiators laughed, dreamed, feared, loved, and suffered just like everyone else. Behind every helmet stood a human being with a story. Tonight, we will tell one of those stories. So allow the noise of the modern world to fade away. Imagine yourself walking through the ancient streets of Rome. Hear the distant sound of merchants calling from crowded markets. Listen to the echo of footsteps on stone roads. Feel the warmth of Mediterranean sunlight reflecting from marble buildings. Somewhere in the distance rises the enormous silhouette of an arena where fate, glory, and death await. As your eyes grow heavier and your breathing becomes slower, prepare to journey into a forgotten world of courage and hardship. Tonight, we begin the tragic life of a Roman gladiator. Long before he became a gladiator, before the roar of crowds echoed through giant arenas, and before his name was shouted by thousands of strangers, he was simply a boy growing up on the edge of the Roman world. His home was a small farming settlement far from the marble temples and crowded streets of Rome. Life there was simple. The days were measured not by politics or wars, but by the rising and setting of the sun. In spring, green fields stretched across the countryside. During summer, golden grain swayed in the warm breeze. Autumn brought harvests, while winter gathered families around fires as cold winds swept across the hills. The boy spent his days helping his father in the fields, caring for animals, and exploring forests with friends. His world felt safe, predictable, and permanent. Like many children, he imagined his future would resemble his father's. He expected to work the land, raise a family, and spend his life in the same place where generations before him had lived. Yet beyond the horizon, forces far larger than he could understand were already moving toward him. The Roman Empire continued expanding its influence across distant territories. Armies marched, governors collected taxes, and conflicts erupted wherever resistance appeared. These events seemed far away until the day they arrived at his doorstep. It began with rumors carried by travelers. Villages had been raided. Soldiers were moving through nearby regions. Some people dismissed the stories. Others grew worried. Then one morning, the rumors became reality. Armed men appeared near the settlement. Panic spread quickly. Families rushed to gather belongings. Some attempted to flee into nearby forests. Others prepared to defend their homes. The boy remembered confusion more than anything else. Shouting voices, running figures, smoke rising into the sky. The terrifying realization that everything familiar was suddenly disappearing. By the end of the day, his world had been shattered. Some villagers were killed. Others escaped. Many, including the boy, were captured, bound together with ropes and placed under guard. The prisoners began a long journey away from the only home they had ever known. At first, he believed the ordeal would end quickly. Surely someone would rescue them. Surely they would return. But as days turned into weeks, hope gradually faded. The roads stretched endlessly ahead. New landscapes appeared beyond every hill. The distance from home grew greater with every step. Eventually, the prisoners arrived in a large Roman city unlike anything the boy had ever seen. Massive stone buildings towered above crowded streets. Markets overflowed with goods from distant lands. Thousands of people moved through the city every day. Yet the captives were not brought there as visitors. They were brought there as merchandise. Standing among dozens of frightened prisoners, the boy witnessed the slave market for the first time. Buyers examined captives carefully, discussing age, health, and strength. Money changed hands. Families were separated. Lives were bought and sold as casually as livestock. When his turn came, a broad-shouldered man with scars across his face stopped in front of him. Unlike many buyers, this man was not a merchant or wealthy landowner. He represented something far different. He worked for a gladiator school. The boy knew nothing about gladiators. He did not understand why the man seemed interested in his build, his height, or the strength in his arms. He only knew that moments later, another transaction had taken place. His future now belonged to someone else. As the sun began to set, he was escorted through the gates of a heavily fortified training school known as a ludus. High walls surrounded the complex. Guards watched every entrance. From somewhere inside came the sounds of shouting, metal striking wood, and men training. The atmosphere felt different from anything he had experienced before. Harder, more dangerous. Standing within the shadow of those walls, the young prisoner realized he was entering a completely new life. He did not yet know that this place would transform him from a frightened farm boy into a fighter whose fate would be decided beneath the gaze of thousands. But as the gates closed behind him with a heavy echo, the first chapter of that transformation had already begun. The first days inside the gladiator school were unlike anything the young prisoner had ever experienced. The facility was surrounded by high stone walls designed to keep people in rather than enemies out. Guards stood watch at every entrance. Heavy wooden gates separated the trainees from the outside world. For many men inside, these walls represented the end of freedom. Some had been captured during wars. Others were criminals sentenced to the arena. A few had entered willingly, hoping to earn fame and fortune. Yet regardless of how they arrived, they all shared the same reality now. Their lives belonged to the school, and their future depended upon their ability to survive. The boy quickly learned that becoming a gladiator was not simply a matter of fighting. It required endless discipline. Every morning began before sunrise. Trainers woke the men while darkness still covered the sky. Meals were simple but filling. Gladiators were fed carefully because their owners viewed them as valuable investments. A dead fighter earned no money. After eating, training began immediately. Wooden swords replaced real weapons during practice. Heavy shields strengthened arms and shoulders. Hours were spent repeating the same movements again and again. Step forward, raise the shield, strike, defend, repeat. The routines seemed endless. Muscles burned, hands blistered, bodies ached, yet no one was allowed to stop. The instructors were often former gladiators themselves, men who had survived years in the arena. Their faces carried scars that served as warnings to every trainee. They demanded perfection because mistakes in training often became deaths in battle. The boy struggled during his first weeks. He had grown up working on a farm and possessed natural strength, but fighting required different skills. He stumbled through drills and found himself exhausted long before training sessions ended. More than once he considered giving up. Yet giving up was not an option. Those who refused to train faced harsh punishment. Survival required adaptation. Slowly, he began improving. His movements became faster. His balance improved. The wooden sword started feeling less awkward in his hands. As the months passed, he also formed friendships with other trainees. Shared hardship created strong bonds. They ate together, trained together, and slept in crowded barracks where conversations often continued long into the night. Some men spoke about families they would never see again. Others dreamed about winning enough victories to earn freedom. Many carried deep fears they rarely admitted aloud. Despite their differences, they understood one another in ways few outsiders could. Every man in the school lived beneath the same shadow. Death waited somewhere ahead. One evening, an older gladiator named Marcus sat beside the young trainee after a particularly difficult day. Marcus had survived numerous battles and earned considerable respect within the school. His body was covered in scars, each marking a moment when he had come close to dying. As they shared a simple meal, Marcus offered advice. He explained that the greatest danger was not fear itself. Fear was natural. Every fighter felt it. The true danger came from allowing fear to control decisions. In the arena, panic killed more men than swords ever did. The young trainee listened carefully. Those words stayed with him. In the months that followed, he learned that gladiator training was as much mental as physical. Fighters needed courage, patience, and self-control. They needed the ability to remain calm while facing situations that would terrify most people. Eventually, the day arrived when the trainees were taken to a small practice arena. For the first time, they fought one another before spectators. The crowd was tiny compared to the great arenas of Rome, yet the experience felt overwhelming. The noise, the anticipation, the knowledge that people were watching every movement. As the young man stepped onto the sand and faced an opponent across the arena, his heart pounded harder than ever before. This was not yet a real gladiator contest, but it was close enough to reveal a frightening truth. One day soon, he would stand before thousands of spectators. One day soon, his training would end. And when that day arrived, victory would mean survival. Defeat could mean death. Months turned into years, and the frightened farm boy who had once entered the gladiator school in chains slowly disappeared. In his place emerged a young fighter shaped by discipline, hardship, and relentless training. His body grew stronger with every passing season. Muscles hardened from endless hours of practice. Scars began appearing on his arms and shoulders, reminders of mistakes made during sparring sessions. The instructors noticed his progress. He was no longer one of the weakest trainees struggling to survive each day. He had become a promising gladiator. Yet with improvement came a new reality. The closer he moved toward readiness, the closer he moved toward the arena itself. Training could only prepare a man for so much. Eventually, every gladiator had to face a real audience. That day arrived sooner than he expected. One morning, the school buzzed with unusual activity. Equipment was inspected. Armor was polished. Selected fighters received instructions from their trainers. The young gladiator soon learned the reason. A local arena would host games, and several trainees were scheduled to participate. The event was not as grand as those held in Rome, but it would be the first true test of everything they had learned. As preparations continued, nervous energy spread throughout the barracks. Some fighters remained silent. Others tried to appear confident. A few joked loudly in an attempt to hide their fear. Deep down, everyone understood what was at stake. Once they stepped into the arena, training would no longer protect them. The consequences would become real. On the morning of the event, the gladiators marched toward the arena under guard. The structure rose above the surrounding streets, its stone walls visible from a great distance. Even from outside, they could hear the crowd gathering. Merchants sold food. Spectators filled the entrances. Excitement hung in the air. For the people arriving to watch, the games promised entertainment. For the men preparing to fight, they promised uncertainty. Waiting beneath the arena proved even more difficult than the training itself. The fighters stood in holding chambers beneath the seating areas while the sounds of the crowd echoed through the stone corridors. Thousands of voices blended into a constant roar. Every cheer and shout reminded them of what waited above. The young gladiator felt his hands trembling slightly. His heart pounded against his chest. Memories of his old life flashed briefly through his mind. The fields of his childhood, his family, the village that no longer existed. He wondered what they would think if they could see him now. Then came the signal. One by one, the fighters were called forward. The young gladiator climbed a narrow passage leading toward daylight. With every step, the noise grew louder. Suddenly, he emerged into the arena itself. The sight stole his breath. Thousands of spectators surrounded him on all sides. Rows upon rows of faces stretched upward beneath the bright sky. Wealthy citizens sat near the front. Ordinary townspeople packed the upper seats. Vendors moved through the crowd. Children pointed excitedly. The arena floor shimmered beneath the sunlight. For a moment, he barely noticed his opponent standing across from him. He was too overwhelmed by the scale of everything. The crowd seemed like a living creature watching his every move. A horn sounded. The fight began. At first, fear threatened to overwhelm him. Every instinct urged him to run. Yet years of training took over. His body moved automatically. Shield raised. Step sideways. Watch the opponent. Stay calm. The instructor's lessons echoed through his mind. The battle felt both incredibly fast and impossibly slow. Blows were exchanged. Shields crashed together. Dust rose from the sand. The crowd reacted to every strike with cheers and gasps. Eventually, an opportunity appeared. The young gladiator reacted instinctively. His opponent stumbled and fell. Moments later, the fight was over. For a second, silence filled his thoughts. Then the crowd erupted. Thousands of voices thundered through the arena. Some celebrated. Others demanded more action. The noise washed over him like a wave. He had survived. His first real fight was over. As he left the arena that day, exhausted but alive, he understood something important. The training school had prepared him for combat. It had not prepared him for the crowd. Their cheers felt intoxicating. Their attention felt powerful. For the first time since losing his freedom, he experienced something unexpected. The arena had terrified him, yet somewhere beneath that fear, he had also felt alive. And that feeling would change everything. After surviving his first battle, the young gladiator returned to the training school as a different man. The fear that had once consumed him had not disappeared, but it had changed. Before entering the arena, death had existed only in his imagination. Now he understood its reality. He had stood face to face with another fighter beneath the eyes of thousands and walked away alive. That experience earned him something valuable within the gladiator school: respect. Other trainees who had not yet fought listened carefully when he described the arena. Veterans nodded approvingly. Even some instructors treated him differently. He had crossed an invisible line. He was no longer preparing to become a gladiator. He was one. Over the following months, additional matches followed. Some were held in small towns. Others took place in larger cities where crowds were bigger and expectations greater. Each arena had its own atmosphere, yet certain things remained the same. The nervous anticipation before a fight, the roar of spectators, the smell of dust, sweat, and blood beneath the hot sun. The strange silence that sometimes filled a fighter's mind once combat began. With experience came confidence. He learned how to read opponents. He learned when to attack and when to wait. Most importantly, he learned that survival often depended upon patience rather than aggression. Many young gladiators entered the arena eager to impress the crowd with bold attacks. Many of those same fighters left the arena on stretchers. The veterans understood something the audience often did not. Gladiatorial combat was not merely a contest of strength. It was a contest of endurance, timing, and discipline. During this period, the young gladiator formed a close friendship with another fighter named Lucius. The two men trained together nearly every day. They shared meals, stories, and dreams of freedom. Lucius had once been a soldier before falling into debt and selling himself into the gladiator system. Unlike many others, he still believed he could someday earn enough victories to secure his release. His optimism was infectious. Whenever training became exhausting or life inside the school felt unbearable, Lucius somehow found reasons to laugh. Their friendship helped both men endure the difficult years. Yet life inside a gladiator school carried a cruel reality. Friendships often existed alongside tragedy. One morning, news spread that a popular fighter had died during games held in another city. The man had survived dozens of battles and was considered highly skilled. Many believed he would eventually earn his freedom. Instead, a single mistake ended everything. The announcement cast a shadow over the entire school. For days afterward, conversations grew quieter. The reality of their profession felt impossible to ignore. No amount of talent guaranteed survival. No level of experience made a fighter invincible. Death waited for everyone. The only uncertainty was when it would arrive. As months turned into years, the young gladiator's reputation continued growing. Spectators began recognizing him. Some remembered his victories. Others admired his fighting style. Crowds occasionally shouted his name when he entered an arena. The attention felt strange. In one sense, he remained a slave whose life belonged to others. Yet, in another sense, he had become a public figure. People who knew nothing about his past cheered for him as though he were a hero. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. He possessed fame without freedom, admiration without control over his own future. One evening, after returning from a successful series of games, he stood alone in the courtyard of the Gladiator school. Above him, stars filled the night sky. Around him, other fighters slept after another long day. As he looked upward, he reflected upon the strange path his life had taken. The frightened boy captured from a distant village felt like someone else entirely. Years of hardship had transformed him into a man capable of surviving one of the most dangerous professions in the Roman world. Yet despite the victories, the cheers, and the growing reputation, one question continued to follow him wherever he went. How long could anyone continue surviving in the arena before luck finally ran out? And as the years ahead would soon reveal, every gladiator eventually faced a battle that changed everything. As his reputation grew, so did the size of the arenas in which he fought. No longer limited to small provincial games, the gladiator was increasingly sent to larger cities, where thousands gathered to watch spectacles organized by wealthy officials eager to impress the public. Each new arena seemed larger than the last, the crowds louder, and the expectations greater. Wherever he traveled, people came to witness the same thing. Men risking their lives for entertainment. Yet after years in the profession, he had begun to see beyond the excitement that captivated spectators. He understood the hidden cost of every cheer. He knew how many fighters carried injuries that never fully healed, and how many men woke each morning wondering if they would still be alive by sunset. Fame looked impressive from the seats of an arena, but it felt very different from the sand below. Despite the dangers, success brought certain rewards: better food, improved living conditions, and greater respect within the gladiator school. Some wealthy admirers even sent gifts to popular fighters. The gladiator found this particularly strange. People who had never spoken to him treated him like a hero. Children pointed at him in the streets. Merchants offered discounts. Wealthy citizens discussed his victories as if they personally knew him. Yet, at the end of every day, he returned to the same reality. He remained a slave. The cheers belonged to the crowd. The profits belonged to his owners. Even his victories were not entirely his own. One summer, he was selected to participate in games held in a major Roman city. The event attracted enormous attention. Weeks before the games began, advertisements appeared throughout the streets and excitement spread among citizens. The organizers promised unforgettable spectacles. Exotic animals were transported from distant provinces. Skilled gladiators arrived from across the empire. The atmosphere resembled a festival. For ordinary Romans, such events provided a welcome escape from daily concerns. For the fighters, they represented another test of survival. The gladiator soon learned that he would face one of the most respected opponents of his career. The man was older, highly experienced, and famous throughout the region. Stories of his victories circulated wherever gladiators gathered. Some claimed he had survived more than 50 arena battles. Others exaggerated the number even further. Regardless of the truth, one fact remained clear. Defeating him would bring tremendous prestige. Losing to him could bring death. As the day of the contest approached, tension filled the gladiator school. Even experienced fighters felt nervous before important matches. The gladiator spent long hours training, reviewing techniques, and preparing mentally for the challenge ahead. His friend Lucius offered encouragement whenever doubts appeared. Together they discussed strategies late into the night. Yet beneath every conversation lingered an uncomfortable reality. No amount of preparation could guarantee victory. When the day finally arrived, the arena overflowed with spectators. Thousands packed the seats, and the noise echoed through the massive structure long before the fighting began. Standing beneath the arena in a waiting chamber, the gladiator felt the familiar mixture of fear and determination. Years earlier, such emotions would have overwhelmed him. Now they felt almost familiar. Fear had become a companion rather than an enemy. The battle that followed became one of the most difficult of his life. His opponent moved with the confidence of a veteran who had survived countless contests. Every attack was measured. Every defense seemed effortless. The crowd watched in fascination as the two fighters exchanged blows beneath the blazing sun. Minutes felt like hours. Sweat poured from beneath armor. Muscles burned from exhaustion. Several times victory seemed within reach for both men. Several times disaster came dangerously close. Eventually, after a long and exhausting struggle, the older gladiator made a mistake. It was small, barely noticeable, yet years of experience had trained the younger fighter to recognize opportunities instantly. He reacted without hesitation. Moments later, the contest was over. The arena erupted. Spectators leapt to their feet. The noise became deafening. For many people in attendance, they had witnessed a thrilling spectacle. For the gladiator standing in the center of the arena, the experience felt very different. As he looked at his defeated opponent, he realized how narrow the line between victory and tragedy truly was. On another day, under slightly different circumstances, their positions could easily have been reversed. That night, celebrations filled the city. His name spread further than ever before, and people spoke of his victory with admiration. Yet, as he sat quietly away from the crowds, he found himself thinking not about glory, but about mortality. The older fighter had once seemed unbeatable. Years of success had created an illusion of invincibility. Yet even legends eventually stumbled. For the first time, the gladiator began wondering not how many victories he could achieve, but how much time remained before fate finally turned against him. And as the years continued to pass, that question would become impossible to ignore. The years passed, and the gladiator became one of the most recognizable fighters in his school. New trainees arrived regularly, young men with the same frightened expressions he once carried when he first entered the stone walls of the Ludus. Many looked at him with admiration. Some saw him as a legend. Others hoped to learn the secrets behind his success. Yet whenever he saw their eager faces, he felt a strange sadness. They viewed the arena as a path toward glory. He knew it was also a path lined with graves. Experience had taught him that survival often depended as much on luck as on skill. No matter how talented a gladiator became, eventually everyone faced a moment when fortune abandoned them. During this period, his closest friend Lucius continued fighting alongside him. Together they had survived years of training, injuries, and battles. Their friendship had become as important as family. In a world where everything could disappear without warning, they trusted one another completely. They often spent evenings discussing dreams of freedom. Lucius still believed they could someday earn enough victories to secure release from the gladiator school. The gladiator wanted to believe it too. Yet with each passing year, he found himself becoming more cautious. He had seen too many promising fighters die before reaching that goal. Hope remained alive, but it no longer felt certain. One autumn, news arrived that a grand series of games would be held in Rome itself. For many gladiators, competing in the capital represented the highest achievement imaginable. The city's arenas attracted enormous crowds, wealthy patrons, and even members of the imperial administration. Selection for such games was considered a great honor. When the list of chosen fighters was announced, both he and Lucius were included. Excitement swept through the school. Some men celebrated. Others grew nervous. The journey to Rome would mark a turning point in many careers. As their caravan approached the city weeks later, the gladiator felt a mixture of awe and unease. Rome was larger than any place he had ever seen. Endless streets stretched across hills covered with temples, monuments, and crowded neighborhoods. The city seemed to contain an entire world within its walls. Hundreds of thousands of people moved through its markets and public squares every day. Above everything rose the enormous amphitheaters where countless spectacles had taken place. Soon, he would stand within one of them. The days leading up to the games were filled with preparation. Gladiators trained intensely while organizers completed final arrangements. Crowds gathered throughout the city discussing the upcoming events. Posters displayed names of famous fighters. Merchants sold souvenirs. Anticipation seemed to fill every street. Yet beneath all the excitement, the gladiator sensed a growing tension among the fighters. Everyone understood that larger arenas meant greater risks. More spectators demanded greater spectacles. More prestige often meant more dangerous contests. On the morning of the games, thousands streamed into the amphitheater. The sound of the crowd resembled distant thunder. Waiting beneath the arena, the gladiator exchanged a few quiet words with Lucius. Neither man knew exactly what the day would bring. They spoke about old memories, about their years together, and about the freedom they still hoped to achieve. It was an ordinary conversation, the kind friends have shared countless times throughout history. Neither realized it would be their last. The games began. One contest followed another. The crowd roared with excitement as fighters entered and left the arena. Eventually, Lucius was called forward. The gladiator watched from the shadows beneath the seating area as his friends stepped into the sunlight. The battle that followed was brutal. First, Lucius fought well. His movements remained sharp and controlled. Several times he seemed close to victory. Then everything changed in an instant. A single misstep, a brief opening. One mistake among thousands of successful movements. The kind of mistake every gladiator feared. The crowd gasped. Moments later, the contest was over. Standing beneath the arena, unable to help, the gladiator felt a hollow emptiness unlike anything he had experienced before. He had seen death many times. Friends had been lost throughout the years. Yet this was different. Lucius had been part of nearly every chapter of his gladiatorial life. Together they had survived hardships that few people could imagine. Now one of them remained, and the other was gone. That evening, while the city celebrated another successful day of games, the gladiator sat alone. The cheers of distant crowds drifted through the night air. For the first time, the arena no longer felt exciting. The fame, the applause, the victories, suddenly they seemed small compared to what had been lost. As darkness settled over Rome, he found himself asking a question he had avoided for years. If survival meant watching everyone around him disappear, what exactly was he fighting for? And for the first time since entering the gladiator school, freedom no longer felt like a dream, felt like a necessity. After the death of Lucius, something changed inside the gladiator. The arena still looked the same. The crowd still cheered. The games continued exactly as they always had. Yet he no longer experienced them in the same way. For years, he had focused on surviving one fight at a time. Victory had been enough. The applause of spectators had occasionally distracted him from the reality of his situation. Now those illusions were gone. Every time he stepped onto the sand, he saw not only his opponent, but also the memory of friends who would never leave the arena alive. Lucius was only the latest among them. The gladiator began noticing how quickly people forgot. Crowds mourned a popular fighter for a day, perhaps a week. Then another spectacle appeared. Another champion emerged. Another battle captured attention. The machine of entertainment continued moving forward, indifferent to those left behind. This realization troubled him deeply. He had spent years risking his life for the excitement of strangers who would barely remember his name once he disappeared. Returning from Rome, he resumed training with the rest of the school. New fighters arrived while others vanished. Life inside the ludus followed its familiar rhythm. Yet his goals had changed. He no longer dreamed about becoming the most famous gladiator in the arena. Fame suddenly seemed fragile and meaningless. Instead, he thought constantly about freedom. For the first time, he began calculating how many victories might still be required to earn his release. Some gladiators achieved freedom after years of exceptional service. A few were awarded a wooden sword known as the rudis, a symbol that their obligations had ended. Receiving one was rare, but not impossible. The gladiator had survived longer than most. His reputation continued growing. If anyone in the school had a chance, it was him. Months passed. More victories followed. His name became increasingly recognized throughout the region. Wealthy patrons requested his appearance at games. Organizers advertised his participation to attract larger crowds. Yet the greater his fame became, the more trapped he sometimes felt. Success increased his value, and increased value meant his owners were reluctant to lose him. Every victory brought him closer to freedom while simultaneously making him more profitable. The contradiction frustrated him. One evening, after returning from another successful event, he found himself speaking with the owner of the Gladiator school. The conversation began casually but eventually turned toward the future. Gathering his courage, the gladiator asked a question he had carried within him for years. Was freedom possible? The owner studied him carefully before answering. He acknowledged the fighter's loyalty, skill, and years of service. He admitted that few gladiators had achieved so much. Then he revealed something unexpected. Discussions regarding his release had already begun. Nothing was guaranteed. More victories might still be necessary. But for the first time, freedom seemed closer than ever before. The news filled him with cautious hope. He tried not to let excitement overwhelm him. Too many times in life, expectations had led to disappointment. Yet as weeks turned into months, signs continued appearing. The school owner treated him with unusual respect. Wealthy sponsors occasionally spoke about his future beyond the arena. Even other gladiators began whispering that his career might soon come to an end. For the first time since his childhood, he allowed himself to imagine a different life. He imagined waking without orders, walking through a city without guards, choosing where to go and how to spend his days. The images felt almost unreal. Freedom had existed in his thoughts for so long that it seemed more like a legend than a genuine possibility. Then came the announcement. A major festival would be held the following year. Thousands would attend. Important officials would be present. If he performed well, his years of service might finally be rewarded. The opportunity he had waited for was approaching. Yet as he lay awake that night staring toward the ceiling of the barracks, he understood the cruel irony of his situation. The closer freedom came, the more dangerous every fight became. Fate had brought him to the edge of a new life. The only question remaining was whether he could survive long enough to reach it. The year of the great festival arrived more quickly than the gladiator expected. For months, anticipation had spread throughout the region. Merchants prepared for enormous crowds. Officials organized celebrations. Travelers journeyed from distant towns to witness the games. For most people, it promised excitement and spectacle. For the gladiator, it represented something far more important. It might be the final chapter of the life he had known for so many years. As preparations continued, he trained harder than ever before. Age had begun leaving subtle marks on his body. He remained strong and experienced, but recovery took longer than it once had. Old injuries occasionally returned to remind him of battles fought years earlier. Scars covered much of his body, each carrying its own story. Some marked victories. Others marked moments when death had come frighteningly close. Looking at them now, he realized they formed a map of his entire adult life. Every scar represented a day he had survived. Every scar had brought him closer to this moment. When the festival finally began, the city overflowed with visitors. Streets filled with merchants, entertainers, soldiers, and spectators. Banners decorated public buildings. Music echoed through crowded squares. The atmosphere felt almost unreal. Yet beneath all the celebration, the gladiator remained focused on a single goal: freedom. The arena itself was magnificent. Thousands upon thousands of people packed the seats. Wealthy citizens occupied the finest sections. Common laborers filled the upper rows. The noise generated by such a crowd was unlike anything else in the world. It rolled through the stone structure like thunder. Standing beneath the arena while waiting for his turn, the gladiator felt surprisingly calm. Years earlier, fear would have dominated his thoughts. Now a different emotion had taken its place. Determination. He had spent too much of his life fighting to stop now. His first contest ended in victory. Then another followed. Days of games stretched into weeks. Each successful performance increased speculation among spectators and officials alike. People began discussing whether the veteran fighter would finally receive his freedom. The possibility spread throughout the city. Even strangers seemed invested in the outcome. Yet fate rarely offers gifts without demanding something in return. During one of the final contests, the gladiator faced a younger opponent known for speed and aggression. The crowd anticipated an exciting battle. They were not disappointed. From the moment the fight began, the younger man attacked relentlessly. The gladiator relied upon experience rather than strength, conserving energy while waiting for opportunities. Minutes passed. The contest grew increasingly intense. Then disaster struck. During a rapid exchange of blows, the younger fighter's weapon found its target. Pain exploded through the gladiator's side. The crowd gasped. Blood stained the sand beneath his feet. For a moment, the world seemed to slow. He staggered backward, struggling to remain standing. Years of survival instincts took over. He raised his shield and focused on breathing. The wound was serious. He knew it immediately. One wrong movement could end everything. Yet surrender meant abandoning the future he had pursued for so long. Gathering every remaining ounce of strength, he continued fighting. The battle that followed became the most difficult of his entire life. Pain accompanied every movement. Exhaustion clouded his thoughts. The younger fighter sensed victory and pressed forward aggressively, but experience remained a powerful weapon. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, the younger man made a critical mistake. The gladiator reacted instinctively. One final exchange ended the contest. The arena erupted. Thousands rose to their feet. The noise became deafening, yet the gladiator barely heard it. His legs felt weak. Blood continued flowing from the wound. As attendants rushed toward him, he looked up at the cheering crowd and wondered if this was how his story would end. He had won, but victory carried a heavy price. For days afterward, he remained confined to a bed while physicians treated his injuries. Recovery was slow. At times, even survival seemed uncertain. During long nights of pain and reflection, he thought about everything he had experienced since arriving at the gladiator school. The years of training, the friendships, the victories, the losses, Lucius, the arena, freedom. And then, one morning, as sunlight entered the room through a small window, visitors arrived carrying news that would change his life forever. The reward he had pursued for so many years had finally been granted. After countless battles and sacrifices, the Roman gladiator was no longer a slave. He was free. Freedom arrived quietly. There was no great parade through the streets, no emperor waiting to congratulate him, and no cheering crowd gathered to celebrate the moment. After years of imagining what freedom might feel like, the reality was strangely simple. One day he was property, and the next he belonged only to himself. The wooden sword that symbolized his release was placed into his hands, and with that single gesture, the life he had known for so many years came to an end. At first, the experience felt almost unreal. For decades, every decision had been made by someone else. He had been told where to sleep, when to train, where to travel, and when to fight. Suddenly, those orders disappeared. No guards watched his movements. No trainer dictated his schedule. No owner determined his future. The freedom he had dreamed about for so long was finally real. Yet he quickly discovered that freedom came with its own challenges. He was no longer a young man. The years spent in the arena had left their mark upon his body. Old wounds ached during cold mornings. Scars covered his skin. His reflexes remained sharp, but he knew he could not continue fighting forever. He needed a new purpose. For the first time in his adult life, he was forced to ask a question that most people take for granted. What kind of life did he actually want? During the months that followed, he traveled through several cities, experiencing the world as a free man. Simple things brought him unexpected joy. He walked through markets without supervision. He sat beside fountains and watched people pass by. He spent hours observing daily life, fascinated by freedoms that ordinary citizens barely noticed. Children playing in the streets, merchants choosing where to open their shops, travelers deciding which roads to follow. For years he had fought for the chance to make such choices himself. Now every day offered possibilities that once seemed impossible. Yet despite his freedom, memories of the arena remained impossible to escape. Wherever he traveled, people recognized him. Some approached with admiration, eager to hear stories of famous battles. Others treated him like a legend. Former gladiators were rare enough, but successful former gladiators were even rarer. Many people seemed disappointed when they discovered that the famous fighter preferred quiet conversations to dramatic tales of bloodshed. The truth was that he had grown tired of violence. He had spent enough years surrounded by death. What he desired now was peace. Eventually, he settled in a small town far from the largest arenas of the empire. The place lacked the excitement of Rome, but that suited him perfectly. Life moved more slowly there. Farmers worked nearby fields. Fishermen brought fresh catches from the river. Families gathered in public squares during evenings. The rhythms of ordinary life felt comforting. He purchased a modest home and began helping train young men interested in self-defense and physical discipline. Unlike the instructors who had once shaped him, he taught patience before aggression, control before strength. He wanted his students to understand that true power came not from defeating others but from mastering oneself. As the years passed, he became a respected figure within the community. Many people knew pieces of his story, though few knew everything. Some saw him as a former champion. Others simply saw a wise older man willing to share advice. Occasionally, travelers arrived carrying news from distant cities. They spoke of new gladiators, new champions, and new spectacles filling the arenas he had once called home. Listening to these stories, he sometimes felt a strange mixture of nostalgia and relief. A part of him would always belong to that world, yet he felt no desire to return. The arena had given him fame, but it had also taken friends, years, and pieces of himself that could never be recovered. One evening, while watching the sun disappear beyond the horizon, he realized something important. For most of his life, he had believed freedom was the ultimate reward. Now he understood that freedom was only the beginning. What truly mattered was what a person chose to do with it. And for the first time since he was a child running through fields far beyond the reach of Rome, he felt something he had almost forgotten existed: peace. The years passed gently, and the former gladiator found himself entering a stage of life he had once believed he would never see. Growing old had seemed impossible during his years in the arena. Every fight had carried the possibility of being his last. Every season had claimed the lives of men stronger, younger, and more talented than himself. Yet somehow he had survived long enough to watch his hair turn gray and the lines on his face deepen with age. The small town he now called home had become familiar and comforting. The people knew him not as a gladiator, but as a neighbor, a teacher, and a respected elder. Children who had once listened to his stories had grown into adults with families of their own. The world continued moving forward while he quietly observed its changes. He still trained occasionally, though no longer with the intensity of his youth. Sometimes young men asked him to demonstrate techniques from his days in the arena. He would smile and show them a few movements, but he always emphasized the same lesson. Survival was more important than victory. Patience was more valuable than aggression. The strongest fighter was often the one who knew when not to fight at all. Many found this surprising coming from a former gladiator. They expected dramatic tales of combat and glory. Instead, they received lessons about discipline, humility, and restraint. One autumn afternoon, a traveler arrived in town carrying news from Rome. As villagers gathered around to listen, the traveler spoke of new arenas, famous champions, political changes, and grand spectacles entertaining the crowds. The stories sounded strangely distant to the former gladiator. Once, such news would have fascinated him. Now he listened with calm detachment. The arena world felt like another lifetime, belonging almost to a different person. Yet certain memories remained vivid. He still remembered the roar of thousands of spectators. He still remembered waiting beneath the arena before a fight. Most of all, he remembered the faces of those who had never left the sand alive. That evening, after the traveler had departed, he sat alone outside his home watching the sunset. The sky glowed with shades of gold and crimson. Looking across the quiet landscape, He thought about Lucius and the many others who had shared his journey. Some had dreamed of freedom but never reached it. Others had died before their stories could be completed. The realization filled him not with sadness but with gratitude. He had been given something precious that many never received. Time. Time to grow old. Time to choose his own path. Time to experience a life beyond survival. As winter approached, he found himself spending more hours reflecting on the strange course of his life. He had begun as a farmer's son, become a prisoner, transformed into a gladiator, and eventually earned his freedom. At each stage, he had believed he understood where his future was leading. At each stage, life had surprised him. The lessons seemed obvious now. No one truly knows where their path will end. People can only continue moving forward and meet each challenge as it arrives. One day, while teaching a small group of young students, one of them asked a question that made him pause. The boy wanted to know whether being a gladiator had been worth it. The former fighter remained silent for several moments before answering. He explained that some experiences cannot be measured as simply good or bad. The arena had brought pain, loss, and fear. It had taken years of his life and claimed many of his friends. Yet it had also taught him resilience, courage, and the value of freedom. Without those hardships, he would not have become the person he was. The answer seemed to satisfy the young student, though the former gladiator continued thinking about it long afterward. That night, lying awake beneath a sky filled with stars, he realized that he no longer defined himself by what he had once been. He was not merely a former slave. He was not merely a former gladiator. He was a man who had endured, adapted, and survived. And as sleep slowly approached, he felt a deep sense of contentment knowing that his life, however difficult it had been, had ultimately become his own. As old age settled fully upon him, the former gladiator found himself thinking less about the future and more about the long road that had brought him to the present. His days had become peaceful. Mornings were spent walking through the town, greeting familiar faces and watching the world wake beneath the rising sun. Afternoons often passed beneath the shade of trees where he would sit and observe children playing nearby. Their laughter reminded him of his own childhood, a life that now seemed impossibly distant. Sometimes he wondered what his younger self would think if he could somehow see the future that awaited him. The boy from the village could never have imagined the arenas, the battles, the fame, or the suffering that lay ahead. Yet neither could he have imagined surviving it all. One spring morning, while walking along a quiet road outside town, he stopped beside a field where farmers were working. The sight stirred memories he had not visited in years. Before the wars, before the chains, before the arena, he had expected to spend his life doing exactly what those men were doing. For a moment, he could almost smell the fields of his childhood and hear the voices of family members long gone. The memories brought sadness, but they also brought gratitude. Age had taught him something important. Life was not defined by the plans people made. It was defined by how they responded when those plans disappeared. Throughout the years, many travelers continued to visit the town. Some recognized him immediately. Others learned his identity only after hearing local stories. A few asked questions about the arena. They wanted to know what it felt like to stand before thousands of spectators. They wanted stories of famous battles and dramatic victories. He answered politely, but his responses often surprised them. The moments he remembered most clearly were rarely the victories themselves. Instead, he remembered friendships formed during difficult times. He remembered conversations shared in training yards late at night. He remembered acts of kindness offered by men who possessed almost nothing. The arena had taught him that courage was not always found in combat. Often, courage appeared in much quieter forms. As the seasons continued passing, he gradually became one of the oldest people in the community. Younger generations viewed him as a source of wisdom. They came seeking advice about work, family, hardship, and uncertainty. The former gladiator rarely offered complicated answers. Most of the lessons he shared had been learned through experience. Endure difficult days because they eventually pass. Appreciate ordinary moments because they never last forever. Value people more than possessions. Protect hope even when circumstances seem hopeless. These lessons sounded simple, yet they contained the knowledge of an entire lifetime. One evening, as the sun disappeared beyond distant hills, he climbed a small rise overlooking the town. The view was beautiful. Smoke drifted from chimneys. Lanterns flickered to life in homes below. Families gathered for evening meals. The scene felt peaceful in a way he once believed impossible. Standing there, he reflected upon the strange journey that had carried him from frightened prisoner to celebrated gladiator and finally to free man. The path had been filled with suffering, yet it had also revealed unexpected beauty. Without hardship, he might never have learned resilience. Without loss, he might never have understood the value of companionship. Without slavery, he might never have appreciated freedom so deeply. As darkness settled across the landscape, he remained standing quietly beneath the stars. He knew his life was approaching its final chapter. The realization did not frighten him. For the first time in many years, he felt completely at peace with his story. He had survived what countless others could not. He had found freedom. He had built a life beyond the arena. Most importantly, he had learned that a person's worth was never determined by the role others forced upon them. Beneath every title, every victory, every defeat, there remained something far more important: the human spirit. And as he looked across the sleeping town below, he felt grateful for every step of the long and extraordinary journey that had brought him there. In the final years of his life, the former gladiator no longer measured time by battles, victories, or festivals. Those things belonged to the distant past now. Instead, he measured time through quieter moments. The changing seasons, the return of migrating birds each spring, the laughter of children who seemed to grow older with every passing year. The gentle rhythm of ordinary life had replaced the constant uncertainty that once defined his existence. For a man who had spent so many years living beneath the shadow of death, such peace felt like the greatest reward imaginable. His body had grown weaker, and the scars he carried seemed more noticeable than ever. Some mornings old injuries ached before he even rose from bed. Yet he rarely complained. Every scar represented a battle survived. Every ache was proof that he had lived long enough to grow old. Many of the men who trained beside him in the gladiator school never received that opportunity. Their stories had ended beneath the sand of distant arenas. He carried their memories with him, especially the memory of Lucius. Even after so many years, he sometimes imagined hearing his friends' laughter during quiet evenings. Rather than bringing sadness, the memory now brought comfort. It reminded him that no one truly journeys through life alone. The people we meet remain with us long after they are gone. One winter evening, as rain tapped softly against the roof of his home, the former gladiator sat beside a small fire and reflected upon the remarkable path his life had taken. He thought about the frightened boy captured from his village so many decades earlier. He thought about the slave markets, the training grounds, the roaring crowds, and the endless battles fought beneath the blazing Roman sun. He remembered moments of despair when freedom seemed impossible. He remembered victories that had once felt like miracles. Looking back, he realized that his life had never been defined by the arena itself. The arena was only a setting. What truly defined his life was the determination to keep moving forward no matter how difficult the circumstances became. Long after the fire had burned low, he remained awake, listening to the storm outside. For the first time, he felt no lingering regrets. There were certainly things he wished had never happened. He wished his family had never been taken from him. He wished his friends had survived. He wished so many years had not been spent in bondage. Yet those wishes no longer carried bitterness. The past could not be changed. What mattered was that he had endured. He had found freedom. He had discovered peace. And perhaps most importantly, he had learned that even the darkest chapters of life do not have to define its ending. As the months passed, his health gradually declined. Friends and neighbors visited often. They brought food, shared stories, and sat beside him during long afternoons. Many of them had known him only as the wise old man who offered advice and kindness. Few fully understood the extraordinary journey hidden behind his quiet smile. Yet whether they knew his history or not, they respected him deeply. He had become a symbol of resilience without ever seeking such a role. Then one calm spring morning, with sunlight streaming gently through the window, the long journey finally came to an end. There was no arena, no cheering crowd, no dramatic final battle, only peace. The former gladiator passed from the world as he had lived his final years, quietly and with dignity. Outside, life continued as it always does. Farmers worked their fields, merchants opened their shops, children played in the streets. The Roman Empire carried on, unaware that one remarkable story had reached its conclusion. Yet his life was never truly about fame or glory. It was about endurance. It was about the strength of the human spirit to survive unimaginable hardship and still remain compassionate. It was about finding freedom after years of captivity and choosing peace after years of violence. In time, his name would be forgotten. The town would change. Generations would come and go. Even the mighty Roman Empire itself would eventually fade into history. But the lessons of his life would remain timeless. Courage is not the absence of fear. Freedom is not something to be taken for granted. And a person's greatest victories are often the ones that never take place before a crowd. As our journey through ancient Rome comes to an end, we leave behind the arenas, the emperors, and the roaring spectators. Instead, we remember a man who began life as a frightened prisoner, became a celebrated gladiator, and ultimately discovered something far more valuable than fame. He discovered peace. And now, as the echoes of ancient Rome fade into the distance and the stars shine quietly above the sleeping world, allow yourself to rest. Let the noise of the arena drift away. Let the centuries dissolve into silence. And as sleep gently arrives, remember the story of a Roman gladiator whose greatest triumph was not surviving the arena, but surviving long enough to truly live.